First, I would like to thank Carol Willis very much and the Skyscraper Museum for the invitation to give this book talk, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss my research and the book itself. So today, I'm going to give one slide on the book itself, very quick overview, just talking about some of the main topics and the key themes. Oh, one thing, could you keep me on time? Okay. What are the time? What's like this, yeah. 30 minutes. All right, perfect. Okay. But the majority of the talk will focus on one specific question, which is why does the Manhattan skyline look the way it does? Why does it have a particular shape where we see one large cluster of skyscrapers downtown and another one several miles to the north in midtown? And there's relatively few skyscrapers, even to this day, in the area in between. So Building the Skyline, just very briefly, is a book about my research, and as Carol said, I'm an economist at Rutgers, Newark, and over the last decade or so, my interests have primarily been in studying the economies of cities, the economics of real estate and skyscrapers, and much of this book discusses my findings from this research agenda over the last decade. So the book is an economic history of the Manhattan skyline, and from 1626 to the present. Perhaps you're wondering what 1626 has to do with the modern skyline, so I'll leave that for you guys to read in the book. So the questions that I seek to answer in the book itself are what were the early real estate decisions that ultimately gave rise to the skyline? What have been the economics of skyscrapers since the late 19th century? And how did these economics influence the number, heights, heights of skyscrapers throughout Manhattan? So that's the book in a nutshell. But today's talk is going to focus on one particular topic. Today, like I said, I want to talk about the shape of the skyline and to try to answer the question about why there's two centers and why skyscrapers are missing from the area in between. Over the years, I've found that hasn't really been that much research on it, and there are, however, a few conventional wisdoms. People talk about a few different items as having been influential, and I hope to convince you that these two most frequently discussed items are not, in fact, or I should say, the evidence doesn't support these two conventional ideas. And so then I'm going to talk about these conventional ideas and then talk about why the evidence doesn't support it, and then I'm going to go on and give you what I have found or what the data suggests about what's going on or what went on in Manhattan's history. I'd also like to say that much of this research was performed, much of the research in today's talk as well as the book was performed with my colleague and co-author Troy Tacey, who's an economist at Fordham University. So I just wanted to give a little shout out to him. Okay. Manhattan skyline is a bit different as to compared to most skylines throughout the world. If we look at this slide as an example of four cities, we see what we might call as the sort of the classic look, the classic skyline look. I know it's small, but it's just meant to sort of illustrate what aerial shots of skylines tend to look like. Here's San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia. They each have, generally speaking, one dense agglomeration of tall buildings and the height of these buildings tend to fall off in general rather rapidly as one moves out of the business district. That's not to say that there are. That's not to say that each skyline is not unique in some way, or there's little subtleties that I'm not going to discuss. Chicago, for example, extends along North Michigan and so forth. But these skylines have a more standard pattern in the sense of having this sort of central business district and then lower rise buildings around it. And what we can say about these is they all have sort of similar histories in the sense that they are all business districts that formed near the historical ports. And they resulted from a series of positive feedback loops. Early settlers, they developed the area around the port when they come and they settle Philadelphia or Boston and so forth. And so then there's a lot of port activity over time as the city grows, as the economy became more sophisticated and technology developed. Businesses began to become larger, and the revenues that they were generating were much greater. And as a result, these businesses tend to push out the residents, who then tended to move out to the outer areas of the city. Then, as businesses grow, it attracts more businesses and different industrial clusters, and it puts pressure on land values, and then as a result, developers aim to build provide more space or build taller. And then in the late 1880s, early 1890s, when the technology and the cost efficiency for skyscrapers emerged, cities like Chicago and New York got into the skyscraper game, as it were. Okay. But Manhattan has a different configuration. You have Lower Manhattan, which I would argue is sort of fits the classic mold, and then you have Midtown, which does not. And I'm going to talk about some of the evidence on how this came to be. All right, since I probably won't have time for everything, I'm going to give you the conclusions up front, okay? All right, so first, if we're looking for the roots of Midtown, we have to go back to the 1830s, nearly a century before the Art Deco giants, such as the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. Midtown proper, or what I call Midtown 1.0, was born around Madison Square in the early 1880s. By 1900, by the turn of the century, land values and office rents were high enough in that neighborhood to establish skyscrapers as profitable investments. Midtown after 1900 continued to move north due to what I call creative destruction and transportation infrastructures. Creative destruction in this case is just a sort of a simple way of saying, as the economy evolves, as technology evolves, there becomes a need for newer buildings and buildings that provide new services and accommodate the new forms of work that occur over time. The conclusion, the second set of conclusions is as follows. The creation of Midtown, I would like to argue, is due to four major phenomena. The first is that the Dutch decided to settle just a few blocks away. So over, I think that way. Basically, on the lower toe of Manhattan. I mean, today we see Lower Manhattan is has expanded quite a bit, and in fact, we're standing on infill right now. But they decided to settle at the lower tip of Manhattan. The implications of this is that as Manhattan grew, as the city grew, much of the economic activity would take place in a northward trajectory. Okay, and this is happening in the context that Manhattan is long and narrow, And what this is doing is it's compressing, if you will, or it's making more concentrated all of the economic activity that's taking place in the city. Keep in mind that by 1900, 1.8 million people were living on the island of Manhattan. Okay, so it's a relatively small geographic area with a very high concentration of population in a very, what I like to call tubular environment, right? So it's, much of the action is along this 13-mile axis. Another key thing here is that in this country, Americans have traditionally voted with their feet by moving out to what I would call the suburbs. Okay, and I'm not talking, as I go through the talk, I'm not talking about the modern suburbs, quarter-acre lots and 4 bedrooms and things like this. I'm really, when I use the word suburbs, I'm really talking about living on the outer, middle and upper income people living on the outer edges of the city. There's nothing inevitable about that occurring. It just seems to be a preference that we have in this country. Okay, and this all emerges during the 1830s, in the period what I call the first inversion. And I'm going to go through this. The pattern of where people are living inverts after the introduction of the streetcar. And this is really, in my opinion, the key change that drives the rise of Midtown. Okay, so let me move on to 2 of the most commonly discussed reasons about why Midtown emerged. And let me show you why the evidence does not support these reasons. Okay, conventional wisdom number 1 is what I call the bedrock theory. Okay, you hear this everywhere. Drives me crazy, but all right. So the story goes something like this. If you look at the depth, imagine we had a shovel and you started digging, maybe not here, but sort of maybe along Wall Street or something like that. You start digging. You're eventually going to hit the bedrock, okay? And starting at the, maybe where the Bowling Green is or something like this, bedrock might be, I don't have the exact numbers, maybe 15, 20 feet below the surface. As you walk north along Broadway, this bedrock starts to descend. So you'd have to dig deeper and deeper. And it keeps descending until you get to the Lower East Side, where it hits the lowest point about 300 feet below the surface. Now, after skyscrapers were invented in the late 1880s, early 1890s, these buildings became very tall and very heavy in total. And it was at that point where engineers and developers had to consider how to properly establish a foundation so the building doesn't lean or settle or have any, it just doesn't lean or settle. Okay. So the story goes something like this: this is the story. The difficulty of reaching the rock floor to anchor the buildings to the bedrock presumably created this barrier to construction. Okay, so the idea is that there's no buildings in the Lower East Side, for example, no very tall buildings on the Lower East Side because of the difficulty in reaching the bedrock. Okay, that's sort of the end of the story from the sort of the general perspective, but it's missing a lot of details. So we did some investigation into this. Okay, so it has led me to conclude that it is just what I call the bedrock myth. It's a nice story, but it doesn't hold up. So in a paper by myself, Troy, and our graduate student, as well as given in Chapter 7 of the book, we detail the evidence in a lot of details. So I just want to summarize what we found. We look at it from both the supply story, from the perspective of a developer, and then the demand story, sort of the point of view from the consumer, right? Supply and demand is my stock and trade. So here's some of the supply evidence. Number 1, there's we don't find any evidence of a technological barrier. In other words, some of the tallest buildings in Lower Manhattan are built over some of the geologically worst environments, and most notably the Woolworth and the Municipal Building. Number 2, when we looked at the cost data, we found that the additional, or what's called the marginal cost, the additional cost of digging another meter, let's say, down towards the bedrock, did not substantially add to the cost of construction. And this even relates to the caisson technologies, which were very expensive. But once you created these caissons, you started digging, the cost of going a few feet deeper really didn't matter all that much. The costs were paid up front, or the majority of the costs were paid up front. But perhaps most importantly, I don't have it on the slide, but if you look at the land values, okay, the land values in Wall Street around 1900 were somewhere like $80, $100 per square foot. All you had to do was walk to just north of City Hall, and land values would have been $20 to $15 per square foot. Okay, the cost of digging these foundations were not that high, okay, relative to the overall costs. Okay, we did some calculations and we showed that a sort of rational developer was looking to save money, could have gone to the area where land values were $15 a square foot, purchased a very cheap lot, paid the extra costs of digging, of creating the foundation, and would have reduced the total cost of the project substantially. Okay, but they did not do that. And the reason is because they would not have made the kind of revenue over the north of City Hall that would have justified paying those costs. Okay? Now, bear with me here because I'm going to show you a graph. Okay? That's another one of my stock and trade here. I promise you it may look a little scary, but it is not. Okay? It's telling you a story. So here's the story. All right, so this is the latitude of the southern point of Manhattan. It's just over there, okay? And then over here is the latitude of Central Park South. Okay, so we're going from south to north. All right, so far that's good, okay? And then here is, this is just measuring how deep is the bedrock below these buildings. Okay, so each dot is a building. And if you take just a random dot and you go over here, you say, okay, this dot here has bedrock some 40 meters below, and it is located a little bit north of City Hall, near Canal Street. Very simple, right? So the triangles are our skyscrapers. We just took all the buildings we could find that were 80 meters or taller and called them a skyscraper, just to make it easy for the analysis. This is as of 1915. So 20 stories in 1915 was considered fairly tall. So what you see here is that going from south to north, the bedrock, these are how deep the bedrock is. It gets deeper, deeper, and deeper. And here's the area that's considered the bedrock valley. Okay? Fact number one is that if you look at these two buildings, they're built over some of the deepest bedrock in the city. I mean, if you read old articles from the Times or the Builders, the Record and Guide, you could just get these amazing chronicles of all the difficulties the engineers and developers had trying to get these buildings to try to create the foundations. But they did it, okay? And the reason they did it was because there was the demand for these buildings. Now that's fact number one. Now fact number two is, if the desire to be in lower Manhattan was strong, but the bedrock depths was a barrier, what would you see? You would see over here a number of skyscrapers. So let's say 100, I'm just making this up as an example, let's say 100 feet or 33 meters was some kind of natural barrier, well then right here you'd see a series of 18-story buildings. But you don't see that, okay? North of Canal Street, north of City Hall, you just see a series of low-rise buildings. Okay, just want to mention that if I didn't. The triangles are the skyscrapers, and the circles are sort of randomly chosen non-skyscrapers, low-rise buildings. They tend to be mostly 5 stories. Okay, so there's a lot more details in the chapter, but this is just what I think is a great example of illustrating how the bedrock story doesn't hold up.
So you're saying the bedrock is close to the surface over here?
It's relatively close to the surface. I mean, it's about 25 or 30 meters. Relative, okay? When you get to 14th Street, or if you go to Central Park, there's outcropping, so a lot of it is actually, some of it is actually above the street level. So the bedrock, here's where Bowling Green, the buildings here have bedrock depths about 10 meters, and then in this sample, it peaks out at maybe 45, 50 meters. And then as you keep going north along Broadway, for example, once you get out north of Canal Street and then, get to 14th Street. So once you're at 14th Street, you're basically, bedrock is just very close to the surface. Okay, moving on. Conventional wisdom number 2 is Grand Central Station. What I call the Grand Central Station theory is that the station caused Midtown, since it was a natural transportation hub. Excuse me here for a second. But I'll take a minute here to briefly discuss how Grand Central Station was not the birth, or not the reason for the birth, or not the reason for the cause. It just was. It promoted its expansion in the 1920s. So just a little bit of background here. In 1902, there was a tunnel crash, and it forced the railroad to build a new terminal and electrify the tracks. Before then, starting in 1873, there was the first New York Central terminal, where the current Grand Central Station is now. But the trains ran on steam, and the tracks were open and uncovered. The current station was completed in 1913, and at that point, the Park Avenue was created, and the so-called Terminal City was created above the tracks. And these were the New York Central promoted high-end real estate, and you can see this today, such as the Waldorf Astoria, or what's the Helmsley Building today, which was once the New York Central Building. So these are examples of some of the buildings that were promoted in the Terminal City. Okay. The problem with the Grand Central Station theory is, number one, Grand Central Station was of little interest before 1913, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But more broadly, north of the depot, there was pollution. I mean, the trains were running on coal and steam, and was not a good environment overall. And furthermore, all the crosstown streets north of the station were highly constricted. Some were only open to pedestrians. Some, one or a few were open to cars. But it was not. You did not have the kind of east-west access that one would have liked to promote real estate development. Okay, and as we'll show you, the first skyscrapers were developed around Madison Square. Okay. So these are the buildings, all the buildings that we could find that were created between 1890 and 1910 that were 80 meters or taller, and they were all built in Lower Manhattan. This is in here just for the fact that it's 80 meters or taller, but one could argue whether it's a skyscraper or not. It's the bell tower for Madison Square Garden, so anyway, it's in there. But all of the skyscrapers built between 1890 and 1900 were constructed in Lower Manhattan. Then, around the turn of the 20th century, something happens. There's a jump. Okay? So these are all the buildings, 80 meters or taller, that were completed between 1901 and 1912. And if you look more closely, what you can see is the greatest concentration of these buildings. Okay, mind you, this is before Grand Central Station was electrified and opened. Most of the buildings were built between Union Square and Madison Square. And, oops, I don't want to give away my next slide here. There's only one that was completed. That was by Grand Central Station. And this was in anticipation. There was I believe it was a hotel. Okay. So, what were the causes? If Grand Central Station evidence is not there and the bedrock theory evidence is not there, then the question is, well, what was going on? So, I want to turn to some of the evidence that we've collected over the years. And to do this, we need to go back in time to about the year 1830. During this time, much of New York was contained in the lower tip of the island, and residential development only went up to about 14th Street. Okay, and above that was relatively undeveloped. Starting around 1830 or so, there were two major innovations in transportation. The first was the omnibus. In 1829, New York City saw the introduction of the omnibus, which is essentially a stagecoach outfitted for urban use. Okay, it had several horses pulling these cars, and maybe 15 people could comfortably ride in one of these. But you could imagine riding on sort of cobblestone streets in one of these things was not very pleasant. And in 1834 was the introduction of the horse-drawn streetcar. And this actually turns out to be a very important technological innovation in New York's transportation history. So a horse-drawn streetcar is, as you can imagine, is you have the car, which holds maybe 20 people, let's say, and it's pulled by a horse. But the car itself, the wheels are embedded in rails, which are embedded in the street. The efficiency of the horse-drawn streetcar was important because it now, for the first time in New York City history, allowed people to commute. They did not have to be dependent on their foot, on walking, to get basically from their homes to work. Okay. So the first question is, where were people living before the introduction of these transportation innovations? Okay. To do this, what I did was I went back to these old directories. And the New York City directories have been published probably annually since the second half of the 18th century. Each of these directories, I guess, you know, if you ask a 14-year-old kid today what the phone book is, he won't know, okay? But these were like the phone books without the phones. They listed the person's name and their residence, and for many of these people, most of the people, they also told you their occupation. So you have residential directories, and you also have business directories, which tell you the name of the company and its location. So I've used these directories to sort of explore and understand the demographic patterns that were taking place on the island in the 19th century. Okay, so don't be scared. I promise. It'll all be clear shortly. So what I did was I collected the residential locations of three groups of people. Those who identified as merchant, those who identified as a smith, and it could be any kind of smith, an ironsmith, but just someone who identified as kind of somebody who was a craftsperson, and a laborer. And these, to me, represent three different economic classes. Okay? The green dots are the merchants, where the merchants are living. The smiths, the blue dots, and the laborers are the red dots. Okay, now what do you notice about this graph? The merchants are living at the very heart of the old city. They are walking to their jobs near the port. The laboring classes are on the periphery. Okay, and this is what this graph tells you here. It's just a way to measure going from the lower tip north. Okay, so this is miles from the southern tip. And you could just think of this as the relative concentration of where people were living. So that's all you need to know. The greatest concentration of merchants in 1827 was some half a mile from the lower tip. The greatest concentration of laborers and smiths were about at mile 2. Okay, so the reason for this is because people were dependent upon walking. Those with the means to have the lowest walk will pay for the right to have that lowest walk. As a result, the merchants will live in the heart of the city, and the outskirts of the city will be with those who have less income. Okay? But what happens in 1849? We see what I call the first inversion. All right? Now, because of the streetcar, transportation and commuting is an option for many people. Not everyone. Where do the merchants go? Well, they jump. And where do they jump to? Mile 2. Okay? So remember, I said I just have laborers and merchants here just to make it simpler. Where are the laborers? Well, they're still at mile 2. They really haven't moved. They've moved to the sort of the outskirts as Broadway became more developed. But it's the merchants now who are living around Washington Square Park, you know, and who are living along Lower Fifth Avenue and so forth. So this is very important, in my opinion, because there are several important implications for the skyline. You know, here we are in 1849, but there are several important implications. Number one, it seems to represent the first time in American history where the upper classes, given the option to commute, decided to move to the suburbs. Okay? Before the walking city, they're living in the south, the heart of the city. After the streetcar, they're moving out to the northern areas of the city. Second, the working class areas remain the very working class areas that had been in place in the early part of the 19th century. These are the neighborhoods that are going to develop as the Lower East Side, as 5 points. Okay, so in some sense, it's where the ethnic enclaves, the so-called slums of New York, are going to emerge out of this fact that once the streetcar is invented, the laboring classes remain where they were, and that they become they are living now in the center of the city, as it were, because you have these new layers. You have the business layer, you have the tenements layer, and then you have the upper income layer. Okay, and that's the second implication. Third, it's this suburbanization, this northward movement of the upper income households that's going to give rise to Midtown. And we could see this as merchant work morphs into finance, right? As merchants morph into CEOs. Okay, so what I did was I collected the directory data for people in finance, insurance, and real estate, and corporate corporate leadership positions, and I looked at where they were working and where they were living. And what you see, I'm going to go to that in 1 second, but I just want to say one thing before I go to the following slide, is that this is the working class neighborhood. And by 1865, you can see the classic New York pattern of the Lower East Side. In this case, they're Irish and Germans that have been coming to the United States for roughly 20 years. And this is some 400 people per acre. Okay? So remember, what happens is the upper classes are migrating northward. And the density is accruing here because as the immigrants come from abroad, they settle in the historical working class districts. Well, here's 1861. The red dots are the location of the finance, insurance, and real estate workers, and what I call corporate service, but they're the CEOs of the companies as they listed it in the directory, as they identified in the directories. So they're all working down here by Wall Street. And in 1861, most of them are living in the center, and they're sort of clustered between, let's say, Houston Street and Union Square. 1879, the job patterns stay roughly similar, a little bit of spreading out, but a vast northward migration of the upper, these sort of represent the upper income groups. 1892, now they're starting to filter up the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side. In 1905, Upper West Side, Upper East Side, Central Park West. All of this was made possible by another transportation innovation. Not yet. We don't even need that yet. To get this pattern, we can go from, but you're right, the subway came after 1904, but even between 1861, 1879, and 1892, you see this northward pattern, and it was made possible by the elevated railroads. The elevated railroads were basically built out in the 1880s, and as I demonstrate in the book, their job essentially was to funnel as many people as possible to their jobs in Lower Manhattan. People could now live further and further away while still maintaining something of a reasonable commute time. Okay, so here we are. Here's that. So now the question is, so what happened? Where's Midtown in all of this? Okay, so to this end, I want to look at the firms. All right, which businesses were moving from Lower Manhattan to Midtown? All right. Now, based on these graphs, and it's what do I got? 10 minutes. Perfect. Okay, I think I could do this. This is directory data from business directory data. Don't worry too much about what these mean. I'll just tell you what they mean. This is just a shorthand way of saying that in the year 1866, 1882, and 1898, bankers did not leave Wall Street. Okay, this point is the same for all three, and that point is roughly mile 0.5. Okay, so bankers weren't going anywhere. They just could not leave Lower Manhattan. It was just too risky for them to move to other places which might have more light and air and less congestion, because they just had to be in the heart of the financial district. Same thing with lawyers. Okay, the funny thing is the bankers were at Wall Street, which is about mile 0.5, and the lawyers seem to be at mile 6. I don't know exactly why that is, but they seem to be a little bit more north of the bankers, but okay. However, when we start to look at some of the other companies that moved, we see very different pattern, okay? Architects. In 1866, 1882, all the architects, well, I don't want to say all, but the vast majority of architects were concentrated about mile .8. Then, by 1898, so sometime between 1882 and 1898, there was a mass migration away from Lower Manhattan to mile 3, Madison Square. Same thing with the newspaper publishers, okay? And the reason is because they wanted to be close to their customers. If you look at the history of New York Times moves to Times Square in 1904. New York Herald moves to Herald Square in 1890. The reason is because they wanted to be close to the Broadway theaters. They wanted to be close to the restaurants, the nightlife, society. All of these things were very important to newspapers. And to be in the thick of it meant you had to move. Okay? Okay. So for time constraints, I'm just going to summarize. Okay, but this is essentially one very important piece of the story. And I'll just summarize while I have some images of early midtown skyscrapers. The Flatiron in 1902, 23rd Street, MetLife, Madison Square, and I hope I pronounced this right, the Croisic building, which is a speculative building built around near Madison Square in 1911. These are sort of perfect illustrations of the skyscrapers that were emerging in the early 20th century around Madison Square. So let me summarize what was happening. Throughout the 19th century, the northern footprint of Manhattan was expanding. Starting in the 1830s, the wealthy began moving up the island and jumped over the tenement districts. The shopping and retail, which I haven't really detailed here, was following this northward movement, up Broadway, up Fifth Avenue, to be around Union Square and Madison Square. At some point, as the concentration of retail and entertainment and other related businesses became dense enough, it started to lure certain kinds of industries away from Lower Manhattan to Madison Square. This includes, for example, publishers and architects. These were companies that depended on local customers for much of their business. And so this then created this positive feedback loop. Other white-collar offices, other firms that were related to these industries then began to move to Midtown. Okay? And out of that, a new business district forms. Okay? So, yeah, so that's what I'll say. The last slide, very last slide. So what about Grand Central Station? Okay? I guess you can't see, this is the map of Midtown Manhattan. I guess you can't see the street grid very well. But again, here's another one of these concentration maps. Here's the story. In let's say 1900 to 1919, this is Madison Square. Okay, you have a few buildings over here later in the second half of this 22-decade period. But the first place for these skyscrapers is here. This is the 1920s and 1930s, the Midtown that was centered around Grand Central Station and also Penn Station on the west side. Then the 40s, after World War II, you see a further northward movement, development of 3rd Avenue, development of 6th Avenue, and the rise of the sort of the modern glass towers. Okay, and all you need to know from this graph is that I took the average distance of these buildings from the lower tip over time. So when each dot is when a building was completed down here and how far it is. And you could just sort of put a trend line there. And the basic conclusion is that Midtown stopped moving north in the year 1991. So basically what happens is in the 80s, you have this big boom promoted, for example, by Koch and so forth, and moving west and north. And since the late 80s, there really hasn't been all of that much in the way of office development. I will leave it there. That's the story. Thank you.
So, if there are questions from the audience, in case I didn't say at the beginning, C-SPAN is filming tonight. I think you were informed as you came in. So we actually have a microphone so that we can, and another camera so that we can get your questions. Don't be intimidated. But I hope some of you will quiz Jason on some of his theories and conclusions or get more information. But please feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, question. Jason, incredibly great data. Your mining of data is really amazing and really puts a lot of concrete to stuff. Could you, though, be underselling the influence of Grand Central Station? What comes to my mind is that the development around Madison Square, as you argue, could also have been strongly influenced by the early Grand Central. Because like in 1880 or 1890, you could get off that train at 42nd Street, which is a big smoking, unpleasant mess, and then take your horse-drawn streetcar, 5 to 8 blocks away, and then you're in a much nicer area. So couldn't the early Grand Central terminal also have strongly influenced the development of the early skyscrapers around Madison Square?
Great question. I will answer it in the way that I sort of think based on the data. There may be subtle effects at work. So, obviously, when you're looking at patterns, you're not. You're sort of you have the forest, and you might lose some of the trees. I would say that. But the couple of things I would say is that based on the commuting data, so we collected the directories. The data in these directories. So, for example, take 1905. What it listed was where people worked and where people lived. So, for example, the finance sector between Brooklyn and Manhattan. So the thing was, you were really only included if you worked in Manhattan or the Bronx, because they weren't going to go out and canvass your address if you lived in Connecticut, for example. So these are people who we know both who work in New York City and live anywhere. Okay, so once they identified you as being, either knocking on your door or that they know where you live in New York City. Does that make sense? So we know that these people were definitely working in New York City and living in New York City. So there's a whole bunch of data points that I don't have here that are people who are living outside the city and working in the city. But when you look at the fraction, it only turns out to be less than 10%. Something like, let's say, roughly speaking, 85 to 90% of the people who were working in Manhattan, even as late as 1900, were coming either from Manhattan, Brooklyn, and then you add in Jersey City and the Bronx, and you're basically at 100%. So to get to your question, there's no real evidence, at least from the point of view of commuting, that rail commuting, like Metro North type commuting, was present at the early part of the 20th century. So in that sense, it doesn't seem that there was a kind of hub yet to develop where workers come in during the day, they walk to their offices, and then they get the rail back home. So that's one thing. The other thing I would just say is that based on the, let me just jump. Oh yeah, based on this graph, the evidence supports that they were just sort of too far away. You can talk about the Flatiron Building as a classic example of the first building to go up in Midtown, 1902, or the tallest building. The tallest building in 1909 was the MetLife Tower on Madison Square. So it just seemed like if Grand Central Station was important, you would see some kind of like building creep, as it were, or tall building creep. See what I'm saying? And I just don't see the evidence there. Now, there might be a more subtle story that I'm just not picking up, but that's my reading of the data. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm just shocked that zoning hasn't entered into your discussion, because I thought for sure that, the lower end of Manhattan had already been zoned or was already developed, and we just couldn't get the owners and residents to allow taller buildings, but the Midtown was sort of undeveloped, and more open to larger buildings. So is there some zoning factor?
Great question. I would argue the short answer is no. And the reason is because everything in our data ends long, well, I don't know if it's long, but just to overstate the case, long before 1916, when zoning goes into effect. So the patterns were already established around, the pattern of Midtown as being Midtown was established from an office point of view in the 1880s and from a skyscraper point of view around the turn of the 20th century. And this predates zoning by about 15 years. So I hope that answers your question. Zoning is obviously influential after that and of course today, but it doesn't affect the patterns that were emerging in the early part of the 20th century.
So you made a comment near the end of your talk with regard to the cessation of the northward movement of skyscrapers. Did you say 1990?
1990, yeah, this is based on the trend line.
So wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wow. Dude, look what's going on. Look on 57th Street. Boom. Talk about skyscrapers. Okay, they're not commercial skyscrapers, but wow. Boom, 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 boom. All these pencil buildings going up to the sky. Now, is that your next book?
Well, I know Carol has written and has exhibitions here about the super slim buildings. So, so in terms of the northward movement, it's sort of a different trend in some sense. I mean, most of these buildings here represent office buildings, commercial. So the super tall buildings that we're seeing now relate to sort of the residential side of the story. So maybe in a residential sense, it's moving Midtown north, but not in a commercial sense. I guess that's the short answer.
Hi, it's a question about the movement of the concentrations. Did you get where you showed the lawyers and architects?
Okay, so this is the bankers, lawyers.
Moving uptown.
Yeah.
So you expressed that really in terms of understanding the kind of proximity to customers and proximity to each other. Are there demand effects from the bank from rents at all? And these are percentage of those workforces, right?
Right. Well, the percentage of firms.
Are there more bankers than there were, even though the percentage is concentrated, if there are a lot more bankers, wouldn't that raise rents and drive these other things as well?
Yeah, I've thought a little bit about this. You're right. There could be a pushing out effect. Okay, but the question then becomes, if you're pushed out, where are you going to go? I don't mean to be glib, but you could have went to the Bronx, and that would have been the most incredibly inexpensive place to go. I mean, I remember reading about the Sanborn Map Company moved to Pelham to get all this great light, and then they regretted that tremendously because they couldn't get anyone to come up to Pelham in the early 1900s. Today, I think the story of Pelham's a little different, but so I'm with you on that. So there could have been a push-out story, but I think the place that they decided to move to is what compels me to draw these conclusions.
Hey, Jason. Let's go like 100 years before a question about zoning.
Yeah.
What do you think the influence of the grid was, which is established? I guess the very beginning of your talk.
Right.
The creation of the grid pattern of inhabiting, how does that affect the development or concentration or movement of the skyline?
It's a great question. The first thing is I don't want to go too much into detail because I would defer to the expert on this. I don't have a great answer to that question, other than to say I think it just allowed for this northward movement to happen sort of gradually. Let's say just people just kept moving north. I mean, as block after block was sort of brought into the grid, then there just became sort of natural succession of developers. If you go to the Upper West Side, you see these rows of townhouses that were attracting upper, middle, and upper income families, around the turn of the century and so forth. So my short response would be, I think the grid plan just sort of allowed for this to take place. If the shape of the streets had been different, maybe it would have encouraged a different outcome. I wish I could go back in time and encourage the commissioners to try a plan B, and then we can jump forward. But so that's the way I would think about it.
I have a question. Well, I have lots of questions, but so having read a good portion of your book, people may not know that you begin with 1609 and the Mannahatta argument, Eric Sanderson's wonderful explanation of what was the natural topography of Manhattan Island. And you make the point with which I agree that the geology is not geography, that the geology that underlies and creates Manhattan does not determine, but in a few cases I think you argue that it does, but it doesn't determine the bedrock myth, and it doesn't, there are other things that it doesn't determine. So if geography is spatial flows rather than the rocks on which people plant their buildings, those things are completely different, and geography would have much more to do with economics. But I wonder if you could comment on something which is in the book that you didn't talk about tonight, and that is the neighborhoods that don't change. So the Lower East Side does not change. The tenement districts don't change. And you argue in the book it's the highest and best use of that land because it's extremely profitable to develop tenements and to rent them out at enormous density. And I think you link the geology to those lower rise areas. But if the central trajectory of development of the island is Broadway and Fifth Avenue for the rich, do you want to comment more on what was the reason that the edges of tenements don't change for 100 years?
Okay. Well, the basic argument, at least the sort of the economic story, is I'm trying to think of the hoteling. There's an economist named Hoteling, right? He has this famous hoteling model, and one could go through all the mathematical equations, and I'm not going to do it. But it's very easy to demonstrate in his model that the central point is always going to be sort of the most desirable. It has the lowest net concentration. I'm sorry to say it'll be the most desirable for universally because it'll have the lowest net total cost to get to the center. Do you see what I'm saying? So naturally, if the center is most desirable, who's going to pay for the most to be there? And so, in essence, I think this is answering your question, but it's not really related to the geology. I can speak to that in a minute. But in essence, really what's happening is in this free market, in this sort of free market real estate market, the central spine becomes the most desirable. And so much of the retail and the commercial and the wealthy, the Gilded Age mansions and so forth are happening in the center simply because it's much easier for these people, these folks to shop and to go to their clubs and participate in society. So as a result, as the rents and the land values become much greater along the spine, it causes there to be population density for the lower income people along the fringes. And if you look at what's happening actually in the 1865, you start to see, the nascent Hell's Kitchen and these are Irish enclaves over here. So you start to see what's happening is the immigrants are funneling into here, and then as they attain a certain amount of economic mobility, they start to move upwards. And there's a great quote from, I think the author's name is Claghorn, correct me if I'm wrong, where she has this quote. It says, it is said that in the Lower East Side, or it is said that among the Jewish immigrants, it is 10 years from Hester Street to Lexington Avenue. So, but in terms of the Lower East Side, one of the things I'll just say briefly, I describe in my book, is I look at the soil fertility. And actually soil fertility is in my opinion, is the real geological story. Down here was had relatively fertile soil. The Greenwich Village over here. and along the Upper East Side as well. And then it was definitely up in Harlem, the Harlem Flats. Upper West Side was rocky, and it had bedrock very close to the surface. It wasn't very good for agriculture. So part of the story, sort of the backstory that happens in the 17th century is these early developments over here based on the creation of the Boweries during the Dutch period. So I'm not sure if that gets to your question or not, but...
Well, yeah, I think it doesn't, since Gerald Capel, who wrote the book on the grid, is here, and you make the argument that it's the least desirable land that's in the center of the island, right, in your book?
Yeah, up here, the common lands.
Why did the worst land become the most expensive, the richest people desire? That's the question, that's the
Okay, well, because, all right, okay, because I think to your point is geology essentially, I don't want to overstate the case, but geology essentially became irrelevant, and distance to convenience became the deciding factor.
I agree with that.
And those who can enjoy the luxuries provided by shopkeepers and the hoteliers and so forth would pay for that right to do so.
Well, I would just add one thing. Through the 1800s, Manhattan was essentially an island, and the only way you access the island was by water. There were no bridges yet. Well, the Brooklyn Bridge was just getting started. So the exterior of Manhattan was largely commercial. That's how you entered the island. And so, as the 19th century developed, the interior of the island became the more exclusive place to be, away from the commercial exterior.
Yeah, essentially the pattern is, if you look at sort of land values and land use and land type, port, with the exception of this really low down tenement district, port, tenements, then there's factories, and then high-end retail. This is sort of layered in this way, more or less up the island, until you hit Central Park, which I argue, just as a parenthetical note, is potentially a blocking point for Midtown, what I would call Midtown 5.0. I mean, if there's this northward trajectory, so anyway, Central Park and zoning combined create sort of a dam from developing further north. That's my argument. Yeah.
One or two more questions. Jim?
Within a short period, the turn of the last century, we have the New York World, we have the Singer Building, and of course we have the Woolworth Building, which remains the most building in the city until 1929, 1930, the Bank of Manhattan, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building, within a short period. Doesn't that clustering along the timeline suggest that some phenomenon at play here is, for other historical events, Depression comes to mind, world wars, which divert attention from certain industries. How do you factor those in?
Okay, I have a couple of responses. I'll try to be quick. The first is that skyscraper construction goes part and parcel with economic growth and economic decline. And the heights of buildings over time and the numbers of buildings over time, they just track they track fairly well. Not necessarily the business cycle per se, but the ebb and flow of New York City. So I'm strongly of the opinion that that the buildings that you see, by and large, I'm not claiming this, are born with some important economic justification. Now, there are plenty of examples, whether it's the Empire State Building versus the Chrysler and so forth, or the World Building, of just trying to be a little bit taller than the next guy. So that brings me to the second point, which is there's a lot of people who talk about somehow that the world's tallest buildings are indicators of economic doom. It's not in my book, but I have a paper on that, and it's just plain, that's another one of those false ideas that you can somehow predict financial panics by looking at the topping out of the Burj Khalifa or something like that. So I don't know if that gets to your question directly, but
My question is, does this mean that we can build high as much as we want, as many skyscrapers how much can New York City handle, like in the future,
Right.
till it becomes disaster?
Okay, well that is a book unto itself. Okay, so I'll just say. So you're saying eliminate zoning, eliminate rent stabilization.
I'm not saying eliminate, I'm saying
Just as as a hypothetical, right? Okay. So here's in today's day and age, it is my strong belief that the real estate market in New York City is highly constrained, highly constricted. Okay, the ability of the real estate community to supply for the demand is restricted. So let's put that aside. Now you're saying sort of rip away all of the constraints. Well, there's two ways to look at this. If just from a purely skyscraper point of view, I mean, there's essentially no limit. I mean, you could build, as they do in China and the Middle East, you could build 80, 90, 100-story buildings, no problem. People will live there. They'll get up and down the buildings. The buildings will be safe, in general. So there are no technological barriers. Really, the great barrier is all the things that must accompany these buildings. And there's no short answer to that other than if a city like New York decided, okay, we're going to build more subways, or we're going to have plans to add more schools as the population grows, and imagine a much larger framework. Then conceivably the city could hold, instead of 8.5 million people, the city could hold 17 million people. But this is a much bigger question than A, we're prepared to have, and B, that can be discussed in 1 minute. So.
I think our minutes are pretty much up, right? So we can continue the discussion over a reception around the corner. There are books available in the bookstore, and there's some there. So if you'd like to have the author inscribe a copy, you have that opportunity. And we have the opportunity now to thank Jason for.
That's a.
You're looking at a railroad.
Yeah, that's a. What?
Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, there was a depot there, but as best I could tell, it wasn't really.
I do tours there, and I study the history.
Yeah.
So there was
but I just don't. I think it was mostly commercial. It was like switching. It wasn't really like, as best I could tell.
And above here, allowed to go in 1932 by steam, and below the Prince Street,
Right.
they went this way.
Yeah.
And they put that tunnel in
Yeah.
Park Avenue to help the horses go up Murray Hill.
And who is new tonight for the first time? Well, great, welcome. So that probably means that you're friends of our author. So, you know, especially welcome. So you're the only ones that don't know that every month we do an author's talk on subjects of skyscrapers, New York history, global history, skyscrapers past and future. So we have a wide constellation of topics that we, urbanism that we like to explore. And they all seem to come together tonight in this particular book. So Building the Skyline, the Birth and Growth of Manhattan Skyscrapers. This is either the first or the second talk that Jason's given, because the book is just fresh out. He's very kind to mention a book that I wrote close to 25 years ago, which is very much on this same topic. But I'm an architectural historian by training, not an economist, although my husband's an economist right there, so you know he keeps me on that straight path. But it's very interesting to be able to study the same material from one disciplinary perspective and then have someone approach exactly the same material from another. So tonight, looking at, well, a few pictures, but a lot of graphs and a lot of analysis, Jason is going to try to prove the same thing that I did, and at least, if not proved, argued in Form Follows Finance, that economics are the most important thing about commercial architecture, and you can read the economic cycles of the city and the skyline. So, so Jason Barr's current academic position is associate professor at Rutgers, Newark. He's in the Department of Economics. He is the director of graduate studies, and he's also, well, he teaches economics and global urban studies, so he's very much on the same beat as all of the topics of interest to the Skyscraper Museum. I know he's doing research on Chinese skyscrapers and the new iconic skylines of almost every Chinese city. His bachelor's, I guess in economics, is from Cornell, and a PhD in economics from Columbia. So he comes with great credentials, and we look forward to being convinced from a different slant that economics built New York.
Okay, great. Thank you.